Welcome to the Barbara Hepworth Museum. Before we actually look at any of her sculptures, let me just fill in the details of her early life. She was born in Yorkshire in 1903 in Wakefield, and her father was a civil engineer, and one of her earliest memories is sitting beside him in his car as he drove around the West Riding of Yorkshire performing his duties. And she says that was when she developed her great love of the landscape that was to be so important in her later life. She went to the Wakefield Girls' High School and knew very early on that she wanted to get involved in the art world, which was quite unusual in those days because it wasn't really considered a proper career for a young lady. But she had the support of her family, and she had the support of the headmistress of the school. And when the other girls went off to do their games, to play their lacrosse and their hockey, she actually was allowed to stay behind and study her art. And she did exceptionally well. She won a scholarship to the Leeds College of Art at the age of 16. And she went there, and after a year actually extended the scholarship and went down to London to study at the Royal College. She stayed on in London to try to win a scholarship to go out to Italy to study sculpting. She didn't win the scholarship, in fact. A young man called John Skeeping won the scholarship. But West Riding of Yorkshire funded her to go out to Italy. They gave her a grant, and she went out for a year and based herself in Florence. And it was while she was out in Italy that she met John Skeeping, the guy who had won the scholarship, and they had a wild, wonderful romance while they were out there, which ended in them getting married in Florence. When John and Barbara returned to England, they settled in London. One of the first sculptures that she did is this one here called Infant. It was done in 1929. She and John Skeeping had a little boy in 1929 called Paul, and she was inspired to produce this piece based on the experience she had looking after Paul as a very young infant. A couple of years later, 1932, she produced this work called Seated Figure. Now, you might well be forgiven looking at this to think that maybe some other sculptor had done that, not Hepworth, because it is so similar to what Henry Moore was producing at this time. So moving from 1932 here, let's go on to 1944, so this middle period of her career. So in the war, material's quite difficult to come by, and it's called landscape sculpture. Interesting that she is now being very influenced by the landscape around her, and at this stage she's living in Cornwall. She and Ben moved down here in 1939. She says that the strings represent the tension that she felt between herself and the landscape, the environment in which she was living. Moving on to the end of this second period in her career, this is an interesting piece. It's called Epidaurus. What happened in 1953, her eldest son, Paul, was serving in the RAF in Malaya. And his plane came down and he and his navigator were killed. And this knocked Hepworth, obviously, for six. And a great friend of hers called Margaret Gardner offered to take her to Greece to act almost as a therapeutic cure to help her get over the death of her son. But Greece did inspire her. And when she came back, she did a series of works like this, each given a Greek name. Moving on to the third session of her, or part of her career, stretching really from 1955 through to her death in 1975. In this period, she concentrated much more on producing bronzes. She wanted to move on to producing much bigger work than she'd been doing previously. In 1960, she was working on this called Single Form September. And she had a great friend called Dag Hammarskjöld, who was Secretary General of the United Nations. And he was a great fan of Hepworth's work. And in 1964, there was a great ceremony in front of the United Nations building in New York, and this sculpture, the bronze sculpture, was unveiled, and there it stands to this day. Now, I did say that when she moved on to bronzes, she wanted to move on to bigger works, and this is certainly one of the bigger works. Inspired, I guess, by her living in this house and being in view of the parish church, and that was the inspiration for this great work. Now, not all the bronzes were made from models. The big one that you saw certainly was. This actually was made from a wood carving that she'd done. It's called river form, and the original done in about 1965, that sort of period. And today's a good day to show it. We put water in it, and the sun shining on the water surface, the ripples reflect on the top of the sculpture, and so you get that river surface feel to the sculpture, which in the original was produced by the grain in the wood. Now, quite a few of the bronzes that she made are what we call multi-piece, more than one piece involved, and this is a good example. And in this multi-piece there is one piece inside another, and people say that this reflects her great interest in the fertility of women and fecundity in general, and the one piece inside the other, people say, reflects that interest in fecundity. So let's finish with this large multi-piece bronze here. This was one of the last pieces that were done before her death. It was done in 1973. At this stage, she was really very frail. She was suffering from cancer and had been for some years. And so she wasn't doing the work herself. She had a small team of skilled artisans who were doing the work under her direction. This piece, I once had, I'm talking to someone about this, and they took one look and said, "Ah, yes, Easter Island." And I know exactly what they mean. And I sometimes describe it as a mini Stonehenge in the corner of the garden. Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson moved down to St Ives in 1939, really to escape dangers in London at the start of the war. And she was to stay here for the rest of her life. They were accepted into the art community that already existed here. In about 1947, a new art society called the Penwith Society was created by the modernists, and Hepworth and Nicholson were extremely influential on the work that was produced by that small group of, or not so small in fact, group of artists who gathered in St Ives and remained here really through till 1975 and beyond.